as Greg alluded to before, this probably won't be the most exciting thing you've seen today, but given the price of fertilizer, maybe it is the most exciting thing that you'll see today. So these are the major points I want to make today. I want to give you the 3 nitrogen strategies, and then also phosphate and its placement with a question mark there, and then make sure that you understand that zinc is important, and then finally a soluble salt cautionary. All right, so, and we had a question about this in the chat here a little bit ago. So the nitrogen nutrition of dry beans is really strange. It's much different than any other legume that we work with. It's just not very the relationship between the rhizobium and the dry bean is just not very strong. And when you inoculate it, when there is inoculum in the soil, the effect is very inconsistent. Things like wet soil, dry soil, too hot, too cold, a little bit of soil salt, more than adapted. All of that can result in sloughing off of the nodules. I think that the reason might be just where it originated. It originated in the state of Mexico, the same state in Mexico, remarkably, that corn originated from. And my guess is at that time, I don't know how many, I can't remember how many thousand years ago, they estimate 6, 7, something like that. That land, those soils must have been very, very fertile, because it just didn't contribute to that genetic relationship of the parallel development of the rhizobium and the relationship. But if you go to China with the soybeans, and you go to the Middle East with the field peas and lentils, alfalfa, and those are a lot more challenging environments, and so it encouraged the development of that relationship. But the same cannot be seen for dry bean, and that's why we handle it differently. So this is a very exciting return to nitrogen graphic, and it comes from the soil fertility circular that I last revised in 2017. That chart, the return to nitrogen, is from 20-cent dry bean price and 30-cent nitrogen price. So you could that same ratio of 30 to 20 would be the same ratio as 60-cent nitrogen and 40-cent dry beans. And I looked it up right before the presentation. I think the bids are somewhere around 45 cents, if I can say. So, and the nitrogen price is certainly, sometimes it's over $1 a pound. And so that critical value, that value that's most profitable, is going to be pushed to the left. And so that'll influence a little bit about what I'm going to say about what to do about nitrogen, because it's not as strong as it would be if the nitrogen price was lower. So there's 3 possible nitrogen strategies, and one of these, the first one was presented to me by a long-term grower up by Fessenden about 15, 20 years ago, when he said he didn't need inoculation and he didn't need fertilization and his yields were really high. So he invited me to this farm, and I came, and it was late July, something like that. And you could just, I could put my hand underneath the dry bean and pick it up, and I lost count of the nodules at 200 and stopped counting. My brain got fuzzy. So he was right. I mean, he'd had a dry bean rotation for a long time, and that farm probably still grows dry beans from time to time. And so there's a strategy of do nothing. If you have those kind of soils with no real issues, land like around St. Thomas, for example. I mean, I worked on those farms for a long time. Fine sandy loams, little problems with too much water or not enough, and so if it's been properly inoculated in the past, then I don't think you have to do anything. And then if you're going into a virgin ground that's never had it before, whether you fertilize or not, I'd still put some inoculation out there. It's going to survive whether or not the plant's benefited from or not. And if you decide that's all you want to do, then it's fine. But again, when it's too hot, too dry, too wet, too cold, the nodules will slough off, and that's just the way it is. And then the original recommendations were fertilize up to 70 pounds of N, but with the end cost of $1 a pound N, even though dry bean price is 45, it still drives the rate to the left. And so I think more of a 50-pound N rate, less soil N and credits, which very often this year is going to mean almost nothing, is probably the most economic rate. And I know there's some of you that apply up to 100 pounds of N, and it's just fine. I mean, it used to be that we'd put a red flag up there because the threat of white mold 25 years ago with the prostrate varieties that we had, it was just really, really real. And so now with the upright varieties, even with the more narrow rows, the top growth isn't near as conducive to white mold as it used to be. But anyway, that should be in the back of your mind, that you don't want to grow excessive top growth. And $50 is $50, times what, quarter section is $8,000. And that's a pretty good chunk of change. It'd probably buy a meal or two out of the expensive restaurant. All right, so on to the phosphate. The dry bean is not a very big user of phosphate, certainly not like corn, certainly not like small grains. And the critical value in the old recommendations that are there are somewhere around that 11 ppm. The amount that's put on there for the high category, the H category, the high category, is just what, I don't know, kind of a pseudo maintenance kind of amount. But as far as contributed any greater yield, I don't think at all. So you're probably looking at a minimal rate of about 20 pounds, which is about 40 pounds of 1152 an acre. And I don't think I'd worry about that this year with the price of P205, $1 a pound. I just figured it out again yesterday just to make sure that I was thinking right. And if you take off $220 off the price of MAP for the value of the nitrogen in a ton of 1152, then the result is about $1 a pound for the P205. I mean, that's a lot. So again, that drives the critical value of the Olson soil test for dry beans down. And I think this year it's somewhere around 7 ppm. So I think above 7 ppm, I don't think I'd give it a thought. And then below that, I'd follow the recs, maybe even shave them a little bit. So that brings us to where in the world do you place it? Before a few years ago, we really, I don't know, I know people did it, but it wasn't something that was really recommended. But Greg Endress and his colleagues at Carrington had done multi-year studies of this for a long time, and so fairly confident that in years where there's some soil moisture at planting time, that an in-furrow application of a very low rate, somewhere around 2 gallon, roughly 2 to 3 at the high end of 1034-0, or the low salt stuff, which is just as harmful to seed as the salt stuff. It's just the danger is coming from urea and not from salt. So anyway, 2 to 3 gallon, whatever you can think of for a phosphate liquid fertilizer, tended to increase the yields over time. So that's a strategy, and you could put some zinc in it too. So there's a publication of this, and you can look that up online. And I think I even have it on my webpage, and I know the extension has it, and I know it's on the Carrington webpage too. So, and Linda probably is going to put it up here in a little bit if she hasn't done it already. So again, the in-furrow seems to be a better option than even broadcast. Again, the dry bean's not a great user, and looks like the in-furrow is a strategy. And again, the rate, this is low rate versus high rate, and the low rate is 2.5 to 3 gallon an acre, high is 5 or 6. So the lesson here is don't do that. There's no need. The reason we put on fertilizer is to increase yield, not to decrease it. And so keep the rate low. Put some water in it if you don't want to see some glugging through the system. Make it the 1034-0 based fertilizers particularly are fairly viscous, and so a little water mixed well with them is a good thing. But In the east here in the valley, I know generally we're in pretty good moisture, east and west of the river. We're not doing too badly. And so we're not starting off the spring like we did last year, but you don't have to go very far west really to get into some land that's still pretty darn dry. And there's some areas in the northwest part of the state, some areas west river where really they haven't had a lot of appreciable moisture that a lot of us had last August, September. They didn't get any of that, and their snowfall's been relatively low too. So if you go into the spring and the soils are pretty dry, and you're doing the strategy of, the calendar date is against you, I'm going to plant and pray for rain. If you do that, don't put any fertilizer with the seed. So as you can see here in Carrington, which is awful dry this last spring, that putting on 2 3/4 gallon of 1034 alone dropped the stand by a third. So you don't want to do that. And then other combinations decreased it even more. And so don't do that. If you really need the phosphate, then you're going to need another strategy. A side band, some other band, but mid-row band doesn't work really. So don't do that either. So that's the phosphate. Not a great user. Rates are low. Put some in furrow if it's moist. Don't put any in if it's really dry. And potash is even less of an exciting thing. So if your soil test of K is greater than 80 part per million, regardless of what your K type is, you're in pretty good shape. If your soil tests are really low, if you're on one of those really low organic matter, sandy, deep sand or villas west of Grand Forks, for example, on into New Rockford, and their soil test is say 50 ppm. Those soils where it's impossible to build potassium levels up, then apply some K2O, 50 pounds. You want the rate up a little bit because spreading is an issue, and you're not going to want to band it with the seed, so don't even consider it. So moving on to zinc, back in the late 90s, when I was surveying the state for copper to try to figure out if it's really a thing or not, which it generally really isn't a thing, but anyway, nobody knew. But I sampled the whole state, three locations in every county in the state on a hilltop slope and depressional area. And on the depressions, as you can see over in the southeast corner of the image there, we're in pretty good shape, and we were back then, and we probably still are right now, of zinc. And when you get up in the slopes that are more eroded, there's hardly any topsoils a lot of times in the slopes and the hills once you get outside the valley, and sometimes inside the valley. Then you have more zinc problems because the zinc tags along with the organic matter pretty much. Let's see. So the exceptions to that, it's really kind of interesting. If you look at the upland, if you look at the blob that's kind of in the northeast part of things, let me see if I have my pointer here. There we go. See that blob right there? That's kind of dry bean country. Isn't it interesting that that's higher in zinc? It's because people have been using zinc on dry beans for what, 40 years? Something like that. Same with the eastern part, more organic matter certainly, but the other thing is that there was more corn, more dry beans, more things that need zinc. Potatoes, for example, people have been putting potatoes on zinc, or zinc on potatoes for 50 years. So those areas that have traditional crops tend to be a little bit higher. But the main thing is, as you get out here in the country, where maybe dry beans haven't been a thing in the past, and you're thinking about maybe doing it, then you really got to be really up on the zinc, because dry beans is one of the 4 crops in the state where you get a response, or can get a response. So we rely on our soil test. We use a DDPA soil test developed out of Colorado State and have for 50 years here. If the soil test is less than 1 part per million, then a small rate of zinc with the starter alleviates the deficiency. And then rates of 1 pint to a quart are sufficient to do whatever you want to do. So it's a fairly cheap fix. So a little bit about sulfur. It's something that we just have to keep aware of. Again, if you're in a drier part of the state, I wouldn't worry a bit about it. If we're in more of a wet part of the state, maybe I'd think a little bit about it. Certainly under the deep sands, I think I'd just put it on as a matter of course. One of the issues with the sulfur deficiencies that we see all over the state in small grains and in corn, and we always use in canola because it has a special need for it. Wouldn't even think about putting canola on the ground without putting some sulfur, is the lack of sulfur in our atmosphere. So this is a map from the National Atmospheric Deposition Service from 2000. And up here, you can see the power plant in the very northwest part of the state across the border in Canada, the plume from it. And these are the plumes along the Missouri of our coal-fired plants. And just a little bit of a trace of it in the coal-fired sugar beet industry. But fast forward to 2020 on the right-hand side, and it all disappears. So those two little dots in our state are a whopping 1 pound, roughly, of sulfate sulfur deposited over the whole year of 2020. So you just get nothing. It's not zero, but it might as well be that we just don't have much in there anymore, and our yields are higher than they used to be. And so the result is that sulfur's a thing. So some people quote their sulfur soil test at me, and it just goes in one ear and out the other because the sulfur soil test is garbage. I don't look at it, don't pay attention to it. I just don't. It's worthless. It's not diagnostic. So, if you have an option on a Swedish soil test to run or not run, that'd be something that's just a waste of energy. So you're going to have sulfur responses, yield increases with sulfur if you're on an area that had some water last fall, had some snowfall this spring, have some water this spring, have soils you can have some leaching. I've even seen it on really high clay soils if it continues to stay wet during May. So that's kind of the thing. And if you use a sulfur fertilizer, don't use elemental sulfur because it's really not an option. Don't use sulfate sulfurs, and absolutely don't put any ammonium thiosulfate liquid with the seed. Don't do that. So finally, is the salt tolerance. So out of all of our major crops, the tolerance of dry beans is probably least compared to, I can't think of one right offhand that has less salt tolerance than dry beans. And so that's one of the reasons why you're traveling around the country and you see a nice field of dry beans, but the first 150 feet along the roadside is completely bare. It's not that the person didn't plant it most of the time. It's just that if it did come up, it came up and died right away. So it's just not very tolerant. So once you get ECs above 1.5 or so, as you can see, this study from Jessica Davis out of Colorado State, you're at about 60% possible yield. It gets higher than that. I don't know. So if you have an option of which fields to plant in, pick the ones that are a little bit less in salt. So that's just a cautionary warning to you. And there's no law in the books that says you have to plant a whole quarter to one thing. I mean, if you really know that you have 20 acres, 30 acres along the roadside that just won't grow dry beans to save you, malting barley contracts are pretty lucrative right now, and there's malting barley places to sell it all around. So consider it. Wheat's another one, not as good as barley, and surprisingly to me anyway, maybe not to you, but to me, oats was just as salt tolerant as barley in our studies up at Langdon and the studies that have been done in Canada over the years. So that's another possibility. And everything this year has a high price tag alongside of it. So I don't, something's better than nothing, I think. So here's a summary slide. So dry beans, response to nitrogen, one of the 3 strategies: don't do anything. You can inoculate if you think it's going to be okay. Use around 50 pounds of N, and then subtract from that any credits that you like. The rest of white mold from excessive top growth is a lot less than it used to be. So pushing it is okay, but just realize that for the most part, in most of our land, it's kind of money wasted. Use a minimal amount of P. Don't use any seed placed if the soil conditions are dry at planting. The K recommendations are minimal, and only a few areas in the state would probably require some for good dry bean yields. Use some sulfur in the part of the state that's wet and you have insufficient precipitation last fall or the spring for leaching, and avoid planting into high salt soils. So I constructed this with the aim of being able to answer some questions. So hopefully there's time for that.